Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of preparing for monitoring, review, and documenting compliance, hosted by the Housing and Community Development. May I have the next slide, please? And much like yesterday, this webinar is designed to permit interaction between HCD and its subrecipients. Please post questions in the chat. HCD will try to respond within the chat feature and will also pause to answer questions at a specified time. Otherwise, participants will be in a listen-only mode. For technical issues, you may also request assistance using the chat feature. This session will be recorded and materials will be posted to the HCD website for future reference and training. See our resource webpage located at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. Let's do a quick recap of day 1. Subrecipients play a vital role in partnership with HCD to ensure compliance, learning and growing experience for all involved. There are 2 types of monitoring, desk or on-site. And there are 3 phases of the monitoring engagement process: pre-monitoring, monitoring, and post-monitoring. There are keys to documenting compliance and successful monitoring, which include record keeping, reporting, communication, planning, and document collection. HCD has developed performance tools and resources within Grants Network for ensuring success of the monitoring review. Next slide, please. Let's go over our agenda for day 2. Today, we'll go over our goals and objectives, compliance records, financial management monitoring, common findings, monitoring preparation, best practices, and we'll also have a Q&A session today as well. Now I'll hand it off to Randall for our goals and objectives.
Hello again, everyone. What are HCD's goals and objectives for day 2? Unlike day 1, we will not be reviewing the monitoring process, but instead enabling subrecipients to gain a better understanding in respect to 5 different elements. The first is documenting progress in implementing your part of the CDBG DR program and performing in a compliant manner. The second is to help understand documenting compliance that is satisfactory, particularly around financial management. This will include a review of complete invoices that have been approved by HCD and are subject to a review in monitoring. The third is to help you better understand what you can expect from an initial subrecipient monitoring. We will also identify for you common findings of subrecipient file review in respect to financial management. And as a result, you'll be able to avoid causing your actions to not satisfy the compliance requirements and perhaps trigger either a concern or a finding. And then lastly, we will give you a few tips, help you better understand how to prepare for a potential subrecipient monitoring using best practices. Now you see the note here below. What we noted yesterday is that we would cover the why and how to of documenting compliance today, and that is exactly what we will be doing. I will now pass the presentation on to Patrick to go over monitoring grant records.
Randall, thank you for that. This is Jarrett Lee with the Civics team. I'll be going over the grant program records. So as we walk through both grant program and project specific records, please note that this will be 1, in a checklist format, and also 2, it's not necessarily comprehensive. It's going to be a little bit of a start or a primer of what documentation HCD monitoring staff would expect a subrecipient to have within their records for ensuring compliance. Different programs and projects will inevitably require documentation beyond these initial checklists. So the idea here is to have you begin thinking about a baseline standard and then expand from there. So first item to begin thinking about when you're looking at maybe the 10,000 foot level, right? Which is a little bit opposed to the project specific level, which might be a little bit more in depth, is the administrative records. HCD monitoring staff will review organizational capacity, and that really plays into the subrecipient requesting reimbursement for staff time worked on a particular program. Some subrecipients might have administration allocations. So the point that these records, with these records is really to set the stage of the organizational structure of each staff member HCD might interact with and outline what exactly they will do in relation to the grant and program implementation. So items such as job titles and descriptions are important to align with written processes in terms of how a program will be managed. And there will always be instances where a process or a restructuring takes place, right? You kind of have that with your subrecipients, with subrecipient groups and with staff turnover, you're going to see that. So the key then is to notate that staffing change or restructuring really of different departments and how it might impact your program in implementation going forward. So continuing with the administration files, there are certain baseline elements of program design, which you as the subrecipient will need to document and have available for review. As it relates to any program applications, this can mean a couple of different things. One, it can mean application materials, which you would have submitted to HCD for approval. So items such as program design plans, locally adopted resolutions, supporting funding sources and uses and beneficiary data, and other decision-making correspondence. But it could also serve as a public notice or advertisement and selection process, which shapes your program. So those application documents could really serve both or one or the other purpose. As a specific example, we'll take a look at maybe the multifamily housing program that included a project solicitation process, which was the initial basis for a subrecipient's multifamily housing development project selection. Any of those program design and decision-making efforts and project evaluation documentation should be documented and recorded to tell the story of how the initial design followed programmatic requirements. Subsequently, any release of these program design decisions to the public to elicit comments or feedback should be memorialized through meeting records as well. So evidence which shows attendance, minutes of actions taken during the meetings, and how the meeting was made available to the public through advertisements. So both the DR and MIT program might also have different requirements in some of those aspects. So it's really important to stay in regular communication with HCD program staff to ensure the proper steps are taken within those programs or those particular funding allocations you are implementing to ensure these initial requirements are met and substantiated through your documentation. And while HCD staff may have requested and received a large portion of this documentation, I will stress it's still incumbent upon you as a subrecipient to have the same records in your possession as record-keeping requirements have been passed down to subrecipients through the Master Standard Agreement or the Standard Agreement. Now we'll take a look at national objective as it relates to a program or activity meeting a national objective. Understanding what documentation is needed up front versus say what might need to be collected as the program or project moves along is really critical to ensuring compliance here. For example, a project which is meeting an area benefit under a low to moderate income national objective might require, among other verification records, some items up front or before the project begins. So in this scenario, documents such as maps, LMI summary data of census tracts and block groups, and a justification of why this project will impact the area selected, along with a calculation of the LMI summary data to ensure 51% or more persons are benefiting in the area, are all documents that might be necessary up front. On the other hand, a direct benefit project, such as verifying LMI households being placed within completed affordable units under the multifamily housing program, might require a plan and more documentation on the back end, right? Or once the project is near completion or completed to verify household income and meet the LMI national objective. In either case, scope and funding changes or even program delays within your activities can adversely or positively impact your ability to meet a national objective. It's important to periodically evaluate or document progress in achieving the goals as initially set out for meeting a specific national objective, something akin to a projected versus actual outcome, right? Additionally, any documentation which support incurring general program or activity costs under the HUD definition of an eligible activity is also necessary. So having a clear picture of what you as the subrecipient intend to utilize the or emit funds on upfront is certainly critical. Developing program budgets, as we'll kind of get into in a little bit, in this particular situation is a really good practice. And as the program or project closes out, subrecipients should also understand what HUD deems as change of use, or whether a specific housing development structure or service will be altered within 5 years of the project being completed. And that could possibly change the dynamic of the originally intended benefit. So through documenting how a project will come to serve the intended beneficiaries or function in the same role for the same purpose as originally intended, the subrecipient is ensuring that the national objective continues to be met after project completion. And this certainly applies to all projects once completed. I'll also point out here at the bottom, which is a great resource for some of the items generally discussed here. It is a HUD training module for understanding how to meet national objectives and ensure what you're doing as a subrecipient is falling within an eligible activity. So when it comes to financial management, a lot of what will be reviewed here on a program level will sometimes translate to what documentation or accounting records a subrecipient will look to file on a project level. One of the most important and sometimes overlooked document is this first one on the checklist, but program budgets and budget reconciliations. Being able to reconcile at the beginning of a program what you as the subrecipient incurred as cost under a program to what has actually been submitted to HCD for payment or reimbursement under those draw requests avoids really a lot of challenges and potential risks down the line of program implementation. That will also help determine when program budget amendments or funding changes will be necessary, which should also be documented as well. A lot of the documents on this list below the budget act as supporting documents then. We discussed financial reports in some detail under day one. So I'll just say here that while these documents will be located in HCD's system of record, Grants Network, subrecipients will still be responsible for ensuring these documents are located within their records in the event they need to be pulled or reviewed in terms of any additional reviews. Program income should always be tracked, even if a determination is made that no program income has been generated, to ensure compliance with the threshold trigger. If the threshold trigger is reached for a calendar year, periodic reporting of the program income generated amount will be necessary. The other documents on this list, an organizational chart, bank statements, and financial reports, are usually accounting records and may apply to your local jurisdiction's general accounting practices. For instance, if you have one general account for all DR emit program payments coming in from HCD, documentation might be requested to see that money trail from initially receiving the funds from HCD to its final resting place, to either reimburse a cost the subrecipient incurred and paid initially, or to pay the vendor for the invoice submitted. We'll discuss bank statements and other financial reports outside of the request for payment submitted to Grants Network in more detail under the project level records. And again, you see a link at the bottom of the Basically CDBG for the Basically CDBG HUD training, which takes you to their financial management module. Another great resource to dive even deeper into some of the topics we just went over. For civil rights, there are 3 baseline requirements which should be looked at from the program level. And we'll discuss section 3 under a project specific record. But for the purposes of maybe some general records, fair housing, section 504, for accessibility requirements, and equal employment opportunities. A lot of the documentation under these requirements describe the activities that you as the subrecipient complete to further fair housing Section 504 and EEO activities. Examples include for fair housing, outreach events, or local jurisdictions adopted resolution for, say, a fair housing month to further and promote fair housing compliance. For Section 504, self-evaluation of all local jurisdiction-owned buildings to confirm accessibility for ADA covered individuals, or a Section 504 plan to document how the subrecipients implement accessibility under new construction, or evidence of job site postings for EEO requirements and notifications of the jurisdiction as an EEO employer on all applicable job application forms. So this last slide here under the program records is just really discussing quickly the policies and procedures. So when it comes to final program records, policies and procedures really outline what and how the subrecipient will implement their program in accordance with the requirements we've just discussed. So the HCD monitoring staff will look at only the final versions of the initial policy or the most current version the subrecipient is utilizing. As we'll mention a couple of times during this day 2 session, the version drafts will not be reviewed unless the draft version is the only policy and procedure document you will have available at the time of the monitoring. We also encourage subrecipients to not keep draft versions within their records if there are official versions. It will sometimes cause confusion in the event a monitor does look at the actual subrecipient records and sees a draft version in there and sees that it might not align with the current version that you have available. So as you see here, there are several policies and procedures we list that you should be thinking about creating to ensure compliance with the grant program and federal regulations. We'll discuss financial management, environmental, procurement and contracts, labor, and Section 3 documentation in more detail coming up in our project specific records portion. It's important to note here that the other requirements are equally important as applicable to your activities. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, some of what we review under project specific records will look very similar to the program records checklist we went over. We wanted to stress that there are record keeping requirements on both the program and the project level. Phil discussed a little bit under day 1 on how you can organize those levels, right? Under general admin, under financial management, and under project and activity files. And we'll discuss that organization a little bit more under the best practices section. But for the purposes of the project specific records section here, we'll focus primarily on what documents you might need to collect and why. So for financial management, individual project budgets is really the basis for your program budgets, right? So naturally, building out project budgets will give the subrecipient a deeper level of understanding, not only in relation to their individual's activities performance, but the performance of the program as a whole, if you have multiple projects. So just like program budgets, documenting the initial budgets, amended budgets, and the current budget, along with reconciliations of the project cost incurred by the subrecipient to what has been requested for payment or reimbursement from HCD, is even more critical on the project level, as this is where the implementation takes place. We've also discussed draw request packets, which are submitted under financial reports within Grants Network, as well as program income. So I'll just say here that documenting this on a project level can also be more beneficial in supporting more general documenting and reporting on a program level. So you might want to take that into consideration when organizing your files. So getting back to bank statements and other financial reports, reviewing these documents on a project level really depends on how you as a subrecipient have structured your accounting records. In accordance with 2 CFR 200-302 B2, a pass-through entity like HCD cannot enforce specific accounting practices or financial management systems onto a subrecipient to perpetuate federal financial management requirements. So whether the subrecipient has a funding account for each project or one funding account for the program as a whole will most likely dictate what level accounting records are kept at. So bank statements, general ledger reports, receipt disbursement, journals, transaction reports, those will all be examined by HCD monitoring staff, depending on the specific scope of the review, whether it's in relation to a specific project or to a specific cost. So as it relates to environmental review documentation records, essentially any activities completed for the environmental review record should be kept and stored. This shows both statutory and regulatory compliance through the actions taken within the documents. So for example, correspondence from the state's Historic Preservation Office confirming no impact of the project on historical sites, or any correspondence from specific agencies to meet environmental regulations are part of a subrecipient's environmental review record, as HEPA or CEQA documents. Additional environmental studies should also be in that record. For the purposes of this training webinar, we won't really go in further into the specific requirements, but I will say here that the level of review is something you should be in communication with the HCD environmental team on as a way to guide document expectations for that environmental review record. Other key documents such as fully executed categorical exclusion, authorization to use grant funds or release of funds, provided to or signed by HCD, should still be kept within your records as a record of compliance. For the project-specific procurement checklist here, it's important to understand an overarching theme. All procurement actions which lead to the selection of a winning bidder, proposer, or firm must be documented. So an independent cost estimate or cost reasonableness review prior to soliciting to know what type of value or price of the scope of services, ensuring no individual has a vested interest in the procurement prior to a selection being made, and any resolutions or approvals required to allow a bid, RFP, or RFQ to be advertised. All of those documents should be dated or timestamped to ensure actions were followed in the correct order, right? So other documents such as actual advertisements, the bid, RFP, or RFQ packet in its entirety, a response submission log showing date and time and confirmation of receipt, a log indicating whether responses were rejected and for what reason or justification, all submitted responses in their entireties, bid tabulations or evaluation sheets and summary rankings to determine the winning response, an award notification to winning response and denial letters to the losing responses. They're all vital to ensuring a detailed procurement history, which tells the story of procurement actions taken to ensure compliance with the federal standard. And then once a procurement transitions into a contract setup steps are still required, right? We will discuss common findings later on in this session as it relates to financial management and national objective mostly. But I'll say here that a common finding for procurement and contract management is completing a federal debarment or suspension check prior to contract execution. It is usually a quick and simple step from a record keeping and paperwork perspective, but often overlooked for some of those same reasons. Additionally, internal approvals like an adopted resolution to sign the contract should also be done prior to the execution of the original contract. Federal regulations at 2 CFR 200-318 require additional justification documented within the file if a time and materials contract is used, and to still set a not to exceed amount to ensure reasonable costs are maintained. Any executed contract amendments or modifications with proper cost reasonableness reviews completed prior to the amendment being finalized with the vendor should also be documented. From there, it comes maybe a little bit straightforward. Performance and payment bond coverage, any additional conflict of interest statements needing to be completed by the vendor, any contract communications which evidence decision-making impacts on scope of budget of the contract, and the notice to proceed, which kicks off the official time frame for contract work completion. So the next two slides review Davis-Bacon or labor standards and Section 3 compliance. As a primer for these slides, I will say that only certain projects might trigger Davis-Bacon or Section 3 applicability. In relation to Davis-Bacon, any DR, MIT, or federal funding which contributes federal assistance of greater than $2,000 towards a construction contract will trigger Davis-Bacon across the entire project. In relation to Section 3, any federal assistance which contributes more than $200,000 towards a housing construction or public housing construction, public works construction project will trigger Section 3 across specific construction services contracts within that project. And I will also say it's important to note that if one project or activity does not trigger Davis-Bacon, it could still trigger Section 3. With that said, we'll just run through this quick list right here in terms of what you should have within your files. You definitely want to make sure construction site postings, including any photos to show that you have the proper notifications up on the job site, any payroll authorization documents for both workers as well as the vendor or the companies, including subcontractors, the executed wage decision form, any approved additional labor classification requests that might be outside of the original form that needed to be added to the project once it started. Those particular requests must go to the Department of Labor for approval. Any weekly certified payroll reports, those should be submitted on a weekly basis within 7 days after the week of work occurs. You want to have a record of both the originals as well as the revised. That will ensure that labor issues are resolved in a timely fashion and that it's notated, right? The idea of telling that story to ensure labor compliance. To that end as well, there's also a labor issues log, which is really a good practice to use to show items that still need resolution, items that have been resolved under specific vendors or subcontractors, whether it's the prime or the sub, right? And it shows the status of resolution, whether or not it has occurred or is still in the process of occurring. So you normally see issues such as restitution and any violations to some of those particular requirements, such as QASA, overtime violations, things like that, you would normally see in that type of a log. And then you would have the HUD employee interviews. Those are interviews conducted throughout the course of the project to ensure that the laborers on site are really receiving what they are supposed to receive in accordance with labor standards. So as for Section 3, as I mentioned earlier, a separate trigger, so to speak, you could have Section 3 documentation within the file as applicable versus, say, Davis-Bacon and what triggers or makes that particular requirement applicable. So in that sense, you want to make sure that there's advertising documentation of different opportunities, right? Job opportunities, business opportunities, training opportunities. You want to make sure that the contractors and vendors that you all will be contracting with have those efforts outlined and documented within their files as well. Any outreach events or any searches as you say are procuring or soliciting for services, you want to make sure that if you do reach out to specific Section 3 businesses, you have that documented within your procurement file. And then reporting. Reporting is probably the biggest piece out of all of this, is just tracking, having reporting forms for your vendors and being able to quickly roll that up into a cumulative total in relation to either labor hours under the final rule, or if there are some older contracts under the old rule, any new Section 3 hires, that you're tracking those goals. And then you have evidence of individual contractor monitoring and oversight. You want to make sure that there is documentation on file that reviews evidence of vendors' work or workers' income self-certification, alignment of labor hours under Section 3 reporting to labor payrolls or other timesheets as applicable in accordance with the final rule, and qualitative efforts to recruit Section 3 residents if Section 3 goals were not reached. I think that third piece is really important, as Section 3 is still considered goals, right? So you want to make sure that you have documentation that shows to the greatest extent feasible that those efforts were made to reach those goals and ensure Section 3 compliance. So with that, I'll hand it over to Randall to go ahead and take over financial management monitoring. Randall.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jared. Financial management monitoring is the focus of the next section of our presentation, and it is typically the first topic that a grantee will select to review with its subrecipients. And HCD has definitely followed that example. Yesterday, Patty went over the 8-step monitoring engagement process with you, beginning with the monitoring schedule, followed by the pre-communication where HCD will contact the subrecipient 45 days prior to an exit conference. She mentioned the monitoring notification letter, which will go out 30 days prior to the entrance conference, and then the monitoring preparation that ensues before the actual conduct of the monitoring event, after which a monitoring report letter will be sent to the subrecipient, and your jurisdiction will have the opportunity to respond, and then the monitoring engagement is closed out when all the issues are resolved. Let's now take a closer look at the components of this process. The first sequence of events relates to pre-monitoring, and we'll focus on it in detail. Pre-monitoring, again, is going to start with the communication that you will receive, but prior to that communication, HCD will have updated a monitoring schedule. This is done on a quarterly basis to reflect any changes in subrecipient risk assessments, which would cause the scheduled monitoring, technical assistance, and training activities to change. It is then followed by the pre-monitoring communication that I mentioned and the notification letter. We'll look at each of these next. The pre-monitoring communication is a more informal kind of exchange. It will be in the form of an email sent from HCD referencing the tentative dates for conducting the monitoring event. The next step involves the issuance of the notification letter, and you see here a letter template that is actually among the numerous exhibits to the monitoring plan. Yesterday, a few of you were interested in what those exhibits entail, and we promised that we would share with you the content of most of those exhibits during this webinar, and this is the first such example. We'll look at this letter in more detail. It begins with the identification of the programs to be monitored and identifies the topic that will be the focus. In the case of the upcoming monitoring later this year, that will be financial management, and the program name will primarily focus on multifamily housing, the MHP program. You will also note here that the paragraphs are related to both on-site and desk monitoring. Depending upon how the monitoring will be conducted, that detail will be included, and of course the other paragraph omitted. But this notification will state the agreed upon date for the monitoring to occur, which is typically a 1-week period with particular emphasis on 3 days toward the middle of the week. The letter also will clarify whether it is on-site or or a desk monitoring or remote monitoring. And in the event that it is a remote monitoring, there will be additional logistical details and the use of technology to conduct the monitoring review in that forum. The monitoring staff point of contact at HCD will be identified in this letter as well. It's important for the subrecipient to remember this is the first person you are to contact when there are questions or issues about the conduct of a monitoring event. The monitor will provide management contact information if there are disputes that need to be elevated or issues the monitor simply cannot address. And also you'll see details related to the area or topic of monitoring. In this case, the arrow is pointing toward financial management, but alternatively, future monitoring events may cover environmental review, FHE&O, procurement, and more. Now, this next item is actually another example of an exhibit to the monitoring plan, and it is a document that will accompany the official notification letter, and we'll look at it more detailed in the next slide. It identifies the subrecipient document requests that either have been made or will be made. These are as a form that will be checked off to indicate those documents that are necessary for a financial management review. And the document, this checklist will, as I mentioned, accompany the notification letter. But those of you who attended the first day of this two-day webinar, remember that Grants Network and Zengen will support the collection of documents for the monitoring reviews. As Jared noted yesterday, the Grants Network miscellaneous task, which Jay walked you through, will be used to identify those documents which HCD has not been able to locate, or documents that need to be collected or updated in order for the review to proceed. The checklist will also indicate which documents need to be seen prior to monitoring. All of these documents are to be available in Grants Network well in advance of the monitoring. So part of the review can actually start before the actual conduct of the event itself. And there should be a time frame noted in the notification letter with expected links to Grants Network and Zengen. The HUD HCD monitoring staff will only request documents, though, that are not currently in Grants Network or any applicable HCD file management system. HCD wants to manage the burden, the administrative burden that this kind of monitoring review would place on you in the same manner that the Department of HUD similarly handles its monitoring visits with grantees in that fashion. The next focus of the components is on the monitoring event itself. This, of course, is the meat of the matter, and it entails an entrance conference, which we'll go over now. The entrance conference includes a kickoff of the monitoring event during a week that is previously confirmed, and it allows HCD staff to identify themselves, discuss the logistics, allow subrecipients to gain clarification about the monitoring engagement. Notes are taken by the HCD monitoring staff member so that there is a record of the entrance conference. And you see on the right-hand side of this slide, another example of an exhibit that is the entrance conference agenda. And you can see how it covers different elements that we'll highlight in particular on the next slide. The next item is the monitoring review itself, which is likely to occur during the most part of a week-long engagement. And it starts with the use of a monitoring checklist. Some of you are familiar with the fact that the Department of HUD publishes a comprehensive monitoring handbook for all of its federal grant programs. And HCD has adapted the financial monitoring review checklist for use in this disaster recovery program. And you will see the same table of contents is used here, beginning with accounting, followed by internal controls, which we'll examine more closely. The monitoring checklist will be used to conduct the review of several areas of regulatory compliance, including the two that I just mentioned. It is where it is necessary for HCD to confirm that compliance has been achieved by your jurisdiction. In this example related to accounting, you see on the left-hand column the sources of documents which actually correspond to the document collection checklist and will be further amplified by any miscellaneous task request, the methodology that the monitor will use, and then the exact questions. In this example, the question asks about the allocation of CDBG DR funds that have been made available from the state to your local jurisdiction. And in this instance, HCD, HUD both look at applicable financial documents to determine compliance, particularly in respect to a key federal requirement of fund accounting, that is separately accounting for a 17DR grant from your perhaps CDBG small cities grant that is awarded similarly by the state of California. After reviewing the documents, such as this chart of accounts that you see exhibited here, HCD monitoring staff will review the question that is posed in the checklist and determine if the document evidences compliance. In this example, that chart of accounts would indicate that the appropriate information is contained in the document, and the monitor then can respond to the question, do the jurisdiction's accounting records satisfy the fund accounting requirement? The HCD monitoring staff, after review of that chart of accounts, then indicates an answer to the checklist question. They make the determination that the documentation either meets the minimum standards or doesn't. Based on this determination of the example and the chart of accounts you see on this slide, there is no finding or concern on this question. The second example we'll look at is internal controls. Here again, you see on the left-hand side the sources of documents that would be reviewed, again corresponding to the document collection checklist, and the methodology that the monitor would use, and the questions that are identified as well. The HCD monitoring staff will review the applicable financial documents prior to making a compliance determination in the same fashion as with accounting. And this analysis enables them to identify any deficiencies that may exist or are potential weaknesses that perhaps require further technical assistance. The organizational chart is an example of how a jurisdiction can demonstrate internal controls. So the HCD monitoring staff will review the applicable organizational documents prior to making the compliance determination. And this allows them to, similarly, as with the earlier examples, determine that the documentation meets the compliance standards. And in this case, because there were sufficient organizational charts demonstrating a separation of duties, the HCD monitoring staff determined that the organizational chart satisfies the standards and no issues are identified in this example. After the determination by HCD monitoring staff that the subrecipient does have those sufficient internal controls, a finding is issued, can be issued due to the risk level presented involving potential fraud, mismanagement of funds due to lack of oversight. But in this case, we found the chart the organizational charts to evidence the separation of duties? And the answer to the question is no. The last item that we wanted to cover in regard to documenting compliance during a monitoring visit relates to the sampling of invoices that are part of HCD's financial reporting workbook. You see that that's highlighted here as one of the documents that Jared went over earlier, and which would appear on that accompanying document collection checklist that you will receive as part of the notification letter. And we'll take a quick look at the second row here, which in the invoicing package, according to the memorandums issued by HCD earlier this year, would require your invoice to be supported with a description of the itemized goods or services purchased. And this enables them to confirm that you have identified the cost per unit of those goods, purchases, or hours worked. Another example would be to look on the fourth row of this slide table, where the question is raised, are costs eligible and do not exceed the budgets by type of cost and have not already been reimbursed by CDBG, DR, or another funding source, or were incurred during a different period of performance? Or are they incurred during the period of performance for which the reimbursement is requested? The invoices that the HCD monitor would sample would be supported by these checklist items being marked off, and they would perform a review to confirm that the jurisdiction has followed the practice and documented in their files the appropriate supporting documentation that was earlier reviewed and approved by HCD. Now we'll take a last look in the monitoring event components at the exit conference itself. Toward the end of the monitoring review, an exit conference is held, and this agenda is shared with the participants in that exit conference. This again is an exhibit within the monitoring plan, and we'll take a closer look at its elements next. It indicates the date on which the exit conference is taking place, either on-site or remote. This actually is an important date. Why? It starts the clock when the subrecipient needs to submit any outstanding items or responses to address applicable issues that are identified during the exit conference. And it also covers at a high level kind of a preview of the results of the monitoring engagement. Now we note here that the results might change. This is an effort to include additional issues that are not discussed during the monitoring. Depending on several factors, those may come up. It's important to note, therefore, this is not a final list. Those issues may not be tied to in the actual monitoring report letter, but we make every effort to provide preliminary results that do cover everything that will be included in the letter. You also see on item 5 that there are notes about any additional needs related to documents that were not completely offered, or for which there are outstanding questions or supplemental documents required. Typically, monitoring staff will note questions or comments by the subrecipients as well that may require additional research or documentation following the exit conference. And then as the next steps, there will be a listing of the remaining needs, next steps, and what the subrecipient that your jurisdiction needs to provide or respond to prior to the issuance of the monitoring report letter. This also sets the deadlines for the subrecipients to submit that documentation, the responses to the questions prior to HCD finalizing that monitoring report letter. And then both HCD monitoring staff and the appropriate subrecipient or jurisdiction staff will sign off on the exit conference agenda with acknowledgement that what was discussed and agreed upon is recorded here. The last segment of this process, the final component, is post-monitoring. let's take a closer look at it. Post-monitoring includes the preliminary response and the monitoring report letter that I described, your response, and then what we have not yet covered, the corrective action complete letter. The preliminary response is that week after the monitoring engagement where your jurisdiction provides or meets the additional request for information documentation, and you may ask clarifying questions of HCD monitoring staff. The monitoring report letter is the most important outcome or deliverable of a monitoring review. You see that the contents are bulleted here, and we'll take a look at particular elements that are of key importance for your future information. The monitoring letter itself is also an exhibit from the monitoring plan, and it details a recap of the monitoring that had occurred, as well as the topic or area of review and the necessary decisions that were reached, or the conclusions reached by HCD, which must be addressed by the subrecipient. Key to this outcome is, of course, the potential for findings, which will be described in more detail momentarily. We will typically describe what was found and identify whether that finding represents a matter of out of compliance. You see examples here. And then if there is such a finding of non-compliance, there is a description of the corrective action that must be taken by the subrecipient to address that finding of non-compliance and remedy the situation. A finding, as you well know, is a deficiency in performance for which there's a clear non-compliance with the statutory, regulatory, or DR or MIT notice requirements. Example here relates to an infrastructure that may have earned more than $35,000 per quarter and was not reported to HUD in keeping a correct an accurate record of program income having been expended. This would be in non-compliance, and in every instance, there will be a citation of the example. A concern is more of an incipient kind of condition, the area of non-compliance that's not yet a clear violation, but could lead to future findings if not corrected. And an example would be where a subrecipient failed to provide evidence that its annual single audit had been in fact uploaded to the federal clearinghouse within the 6 months of the end of the subrecipient's fiscal year. The corrective action will be specified as action to be taken by the subrecipient that corrects those deficiencies, addresses the concern, or otherwise produces the recommended improvements. And an example here would be the subrecipient updating its policies and procedures to include reporting and tracking of program income, including the actual accounting of all PI, which has reached the threshold trigger for current and prior years. Now I will turn this next section of the presentation over to Patrick. It is Patrick this time who will cover common findings.
Thank you, Randall. Good morning, everyone. Going to, after all of that groundwork, going to step through some of the common findings. The first one is record keeping. 24 CFR 570-490 spells out record keeping requirements. The 2 CFR 200-334 spells out retention requirements for records, and 2 CFR 200-337 spells out access to records and then records of non-federal entities. So bringing it full circle again back to record keeping, we mentioned in day one, accurate record keeping is crucial for the successful management of your CDBG funded activities. It's essential for tracking your performance against your contract goals and allows you to provide it helps the grantee provide management support in its oversight of your activities. And we've also mentioned along the way, failure to document your CDBG funded activities adequately can undermine the success of your projects. So your ability to readily document compliance will depend on the strength of that record keeping process. Next slide. Next common finding is financial management. 24 CFR 57489D is the program, actually 57489 is the program administrative requirements. 489D goes a step further, it talks about fiscal controls and accounting procedures. So in that section, it states that a state shall have fiscal and administrative requirements for expending and accounting all funds received under that subpart. And these requirements must be available for federal inspection. The next part of 489D states that a state may satisfy this requirement by opting to satisfy the requirement for fiscal controls and administrative procedures by applying the provisions of 2 CFR Part 200. And that they must also ensure that their recipients comply with 2 CFR Part 200 as well. So tying those together. I'm going to throw in, it's not on the slide, but another common finding under financial management is program income, which is 57489E. Stepping back to 2 CFR 200, it establishes the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, audit requirements for federal awards to non-federal entities. Some additional common findings within financial management include unauthorized signers on checks, allowing one signature check authorization without having an approved 2 signature waiver on file, commingling funds in general fund bank accounts without having an approved separate bank account waiver, utilizing multiple bank accounts for receipts and disbursement of funds for individual projects, depositing grant funds into the incorrect bank account when having multiple active grants. Next slide. Next slide talks about common findings, financial management and procurement. 24 CFR 570-489G talks about vendors, and 489H is the conflict of interest. 2 CFR 200-323 talks about cost or price analysis in advance of issuing bids. Lack of HUD required provisions is another common finding in that procurement, missing section 3, not complying with minority and women enterprise opportunities, and then benchmarking. Some specific common findings under financial management and procurement include unauthorized signers on checks, unauthorized signers on RFPs, invoices and construction not properly stamped, marked, or approved, improperly executed change orders, missing construction contract draw request forms. Also, failure to prepare independent cost estimates prior to receiving bids or approvals is another common finding for financial management and procurement. Last one that we've included is common finding national objective. 24 CFR 570-489 spells out the criteria of the national objective. And putting this one in there, we do have the link there to basically CDBG HUD training as a resource. But this is a common finding along with some of the other findings. They are common because of mostly due to a lack of documentation and record keeping. So coming back again to the importance of documentation and record keeping. And now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared to step through some monitoring preparation best practices.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Appreciate that. All right. So we're, I think, at this point in the home stretch. I have a few minutes left. and we'll go through a couple of quick tips and pointers. These will be a little bit of repetition from some of the different highlights and pieces of both days of the sessions of training here. So really, I think the first question HCD certainly wants to ask, and this might occur in some of the pre-monitoring communications, is, has HCD given enough information to the subrecipients to prepare effectively? And so some of those elements, right, in terms of best practices that the HCD monitoring staff is looking to do, is to send a monitoring notification letter to ensure that the document request is there and available. And, you know, part of that is this training, right, and ensuring that you're aware of how miscellaneous tasks might work in relation to some of the document collection techniques that might occur. So the idea is certainly to over communicate in the beginning portions of a monitoring review during that pre-monitoring phase. With that said, if there are questions or items that you feel are unclear in relation to the coordination of documents and how those are going to be submitted or transferred, or in relation to, you know, what Patty or what Randall or what Patrick might have discussed in the past sessions, the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and kind of understanding who should be at the monitoring, understanding what the scope of the review, the area of focus might be, and when kind of that schedule is set, what type of interviews are going to be done during the monitoring, and what other sessions might be needed to ensure compliance throughout the monitoring review. Ask away. I think it's important that HCD encourages here the idea of, you know, not only asking verbally, but certainly sending an email, requesting it in writing to be able to sufficiently prepare for the monitoring. So again, it's a kind of a vital best practice here, is to almost over prepare in that aspect. One other thing to note here certainly is that HCD monitoring staff are here to support the subrecipient throughout the monitoring process, and really from beginning to end until the corrective actions complete letter is issued, right? So whether that's, you know, not necessarily a review, whether it's technical assistance or guidance, that goes back to the partnership discussion that we've had in the earlier parts of day one. So in terms of access to records, this is a piece where I think HCD, in terms of the process and the idea of collecting documents, or ensuring that they have grants network set up, available, ready to collect documents for the monitoring review. But at the same time, if a subrecipient does have records in certain spots that make it difficult to transfer that information, and there's you know, on the flip side, access to records that's needed, it's okay to communicate that to HCD, right? If it's easier to have the monitors have access to your records, make sure that's known up front, right? You want to make sure in the monitoring, the pre-monitoring phase, you're kind of coordinating with the staff to ensure access to those records. So if logins or passwords are necessary, and your IT staff might need to be involved to test accounts, you're kind of doing those things before the monitoring, before the day of the monitors getting on there, boots on the ground, and doing the entrance conference. So you want to try and recommend, or we recommend trying to do that in testing at least 1 to 2 weeks prior to the conference, the entrance conference. You want to test the view to ensure monitors have the correct viewing rights and are able to access the documentation they need. And then send the login and password information to the monitors prior to that conference. So however that might work, again, the idea is to communicate that through and ensure logistics are set up before day one of the monitoring. In terms of monitoring staffing needs, we talked a little bit about this in the first slide of this section. You really want to determine who is required to participate. Those are folks who have specialized knowledge based on the specific focus area that is going to be monitored. So in this instance, we're talking about financial management monitoring, letting subrecipients here within this training know that that might be really the first or the primary focus area of some initial subrecipient monitoring. So you have a little bit of an idea of who should be there, right? Your accounting staff, your financial analysts, those who generate those accounting reports that we talked about through a lot of different sections here under day 2. They should be present or at least available for phone calls, conference calls, can virtually connect, and that they're available for any timely email responses throughout that week, right? There's other staff who might need to be involved as well, administrative staff for scheduling or coordinating logistics, program managers who might have a specific take on the actual project or activity that might be monitored, purchasing department for any procurement reviews that might occur, and then the engineering department if there's technical questions along the lines of cost reasonableness reviews, things like that. Those folks can certainly play a vital role in the monitoring review as well. And then last, certainly not least, there are a number of subrecipients who might have consultants who perform administrative or professional services and who are contracted to assist with this monitoring. That's completely okay. HCD would still note though that the monitoring review is with the subrecipient staff. It's important that at least one member of a subrecipient staff is involved with all meetings or interviews or any interaction throughout the monitoring review. There should be one staff member available within those meetings throughout the monitoring week. So certainly would welcome that assistance and help that you all might contract with to help you implement your programs. In terms of monitoring prep, self-evaluation, that should happen as soon as you're notified of the monitoring engagement, or at least start thinking about how you can do some of that monitoring, some of that self-evaluation. You really want to focus on the specific areas called out for monitoring. The scope of the review is put into the monitoring notification letter for a reason. It gives you advance notice to prepare for the monitoring. You can use a number of different checklists. You could even start with some of the checklists here. You want to look at a couple of different examples. We're going to kind of go through that in the next slide or two here. But you want to try and conduct that file review, right? Using a checklist template, a review template. It could be a specific document checklist that you might have used in the past or that has been provided to you by your program staff. There's a number of different ways you can review to prepare for the monitoring. Part of this, and I think to Randall's point and what was said earlier, there's certainly some exhibits that we've gone over in relation to the review. So there's certainly more to come on some of those checklists that might be that HCD monitoring staff might use in relation to the review. You want to record any documents that might be missing and work on locating those documents. And that might require some additional research, right? So if you have 30 days, you have a good 3 or 4 weeks to do that. and you want to organize the files in a manner which can be easily explained. So if there are some hard copy or paper files, in terms of organization, putting them in a proper order, like chronologically, would probably be one of your best practices or your best bets to do that, to provide to monitors to review. In terms of self-evaluation reviews, we provide a link here for the HUD monitoring checklist. You can certainly feel free to use some of those. The checklists that are used for HCD are modified and tailored, but the basis, the starting point for the HCD monitoring review checklist were the CPD, the HUD CPD checklist, that link that you have here. So you'll be able to kind of click on that link when the slides are provided at the end of this session. We'll talk a little bit more about when the training materials might be up. The goal is to have the ability to clearly answer yes, or to clearly answer that the question has been satisfied within those review checklists. But please note that even though if there's a result of that self-evaluation, that everything has been satisfied, it may not necessarily mean that a monitoring will result in no findings or concerns. But again, that is a good preparation tactic for you as you approach monitoring. So file review: should a document be in the file? In terms of file completeness and conciseness, working together to demonstrate compliance, you want to ensure that your file system shows a complete picture of what happened, right? We talked about some procurement actions. We talked about other decision-making actions. You want to ensure that if you have a document in your file, and that's your point A, and then you have another document in your file that's your point B, you show the evolution, the justification of how you went from point A to point B in implementing your program or project, as it relates to even a very specific action like procurement. In that same token, there's a balance, right? There needs to be a balance between completeness and conciseness. And are they documented in a way and organized in a manner to where monitors are not having to dig through those numerous incomplete documents? So duplicativeness, or drafts, which we'll go into the next slide. That's really what you're wanting to make sure is not something that's in your file to really hide some of the more important documents that are in there. And just remember, monitoring is a snapshot assessment of compliance in a moment in time. So when the monitoring occurs, there might be a period of time, usually it's about a year prior to the monitoring, that will be looked at in terms of, say for financial management, there will be submitted payments requests that will be looked at most likely within the last year. There's very few instances that might occur where there's a review that looks back in time further than that particular 1 year period. So we talked about duplicates, we talked about drafts and unexecuted documents. You want to make sure that those are not in the file to kind of conflate the monitor into understanding what documentation should be looked at. There are some exceptions, right? Contracts that are in the process of being executed, original contract, to note that performance or progress is moving forward on a project. You might want to include that to kind of show that step is being taken as you're being monitored, right? In terms of draft versions of policies and procedures, same thing. You wouldn't necessarily want to include those if you already have official versions. So last slide here, file review. Is a file complete? When reviewing a file for completeness and accuracy, you want to focus on these 3 key items. And really this goes to the larger almost storytelling component we've talked about. Does your file tell the story? Does it ensure that communication with contractors, with approving entities, and to support decision-making, all of those are documented clearly? Does it confirm that you've done outreach on some of those requirements that require outreach? We talked about that in Section 3 and fair housing, and some of those other cross-cutting requirements. And then in terms of actions, actions can mean fully executed documents, right? It could include procurement actions that were done that might be outside of a normal review and ranking of respondents to determine who is the winning bidder or who is the winning proposer. And then notification history, right? Those letters, those 1-page notice to proceeds or 1-page award letters to notate, that a determination has been made, a decision has been reached. So really that recommendation, right? Build your files to tell the story of your program history. Record keeping is still one of the primary findings, common findings for monitoring reviews. That's really where a lot of things can sometimes be a challenge for entities when implementing their program. So with that, I will go ahead and pass it back over to Sergio to address any questions. Sergio.
Thank you, Jared. So we will now open the session up to questions in the chat. So just go ahead. If you have any questions, please enter them there. I will read the first question we have is from Jose. We have 3 projects, 1 DR and 2 MIT. The city has 1 operating account. What triggers having to open a separate bank account? One of your presenters mentioned a separate bank waiver. Who would like to take that one?
I can probably
Sergio.
take that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, Jared and I, Randall, can probably answer that question. The financial management review checklist does refer to a question that is undergirded by segregating the different allocations that have been made according to the program. We would urge you to confer with your program contact at HCD and determine whether it's necessary to set up a separate bank account. What I was referencing in terms of fund accounting is having a separate account on your chart of accounts. That does not necessarily mean a separate banking relationship. Jared, did you want to amplify?
I'll maybe see if Sergio, if you want to have that respondent maybe ask any follow-up questions. See if we answered it right.
Jose, did you have any additional, did you have a follow-up question to that? Oh no, as he said, that clarifies things. They do have separate funds.
So if I could just jump in really quick, just as a follow-up to how Randall clarified that yes, the idea is to be able to show what HCD will be looking for is kind of the same thing that they have to show HUD, right? Is that your grant funds get tracked within its own account within your overall chart of accounts, so that it's really clear where your expenditures are and what they're going towards, and then the funds that you've been reimbursed, so that you can, in your general ledger, it's really clear to show that one-to-one. So as Randall said, like not necessarily not a separate bank account, but a clear accounting log of those credits and debits on your accounting side.
Yeah, I think one of the things I mentioned was a money trail, right? I mean, that's pretty much what you're looking to see through your accounting reports is that flow of funds in and out of these accounts.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I appreciate the answer. The next question we have is from Jennifer. She says, can a monitoring be completed after the 3-year time frame to retain all documents? Or is it safe to then begin purging documents? So who would like to take that?
I can answer that, Sergio. I think in relation to the record retention requirement, it's 3 years from the date that HUD closes the grant with the grantee, right? So one of the common misconceptions, I think, in this scenario is when you go ahead and as a subrecipient, you close out your standard agreement or your master standard agreement with HCD, that doesn't necessarily start the 3-year clock or that 3-year window, right? So it's 3 years from HCD's closeout with HUD. So in that aspect, it's almost like it's like a plus 3 years at some point in time in the future, right? So your 3-year clock hasn't really started yet. So it's probably important. We talk about communication a lot in this training. It's probably important even after that closeout to still communicate with the program staff, maybe periodically, maybe once a quarter, things like that, to ensure that when that clock starts. And I'm sure when you get to that point with HCD, there might be some additional guidance, right, on maybe transfer of records and things like that. But I think that would probably come at a later time.
Thank you, Jared. So we're running low on time, so we may only have time for a few more questions. Does anyone have any additional questions? Okay, so do we have any other questions?
Yeah, Sergio, I just had a follow-up to that. So this is Joe Harney from the MHP team. For the timing on the record retention, how does that factor in with the 20-year long-term affordability monitoring and such? Or are we saying that the 3 years ends, that date, or is it going to be the expenditure deadline in 2026?
Well,
we will have to take that offline. We're running short on time. Joe, thank you for the question. If you can send me that, or I'll pull it from the recording, but we'll add that to the FAQ.
Great, thank you.
So any additional questions not answered, we will move to the FAQ, okay? Thank you all for your participation. We'll now move to the next steps. We're gonna go to Randall.
All right, thank you, Sergio. So what is to come? The next steps will be based on the subrecipient risk assessment that was described earlier by this panel. And it will be guided specifically by the monitoring schedule for the upcoming quarters. It's important for you to note that a small number of subrecipients can expect to be contacted about a monitoring engagement this summer or early fall. We want to remind you that each of those subrecipients will hear from HCD 45 days prior to the monitoring event. Not surprisingly, the main topic will be financial management and related matters. As Jared mentioned, there are questions that will come up in the financial management review checklist that trigger looking at national objectives, eligible activities, and so forth. And there will be further details included with the notification, as I illustrated earlier. Both those first selected subrecipients and others should continue to prepare for possible monitoring reviews that will continue in 2023. And we would urge you to routinely document compliance record keeping. Follow Jared's tips of looking at the checklist. We want to get you to yes, which means no finding or concern. you want to avoid a no, which means that there is one of those less desirable conclusions, you can help prevent that by looking at the checklist in advance. And then, of course, maintain your regular communication with HCD program liaisons. You can look at the CDBG DR monitoring plan that is linked here for further details, and particularly cull through this set of slides to look at exhibits that I mentioned earlier. And of course, attend the upcoming webinars on topics to gain a deeper understanding.
And here are the additional resources available for you guys to use on the CDBG website, HCD website. This will be part of the PowerPoint. I'm going to now give this off to Samina for closing remarks.
Thank you, Sergio. I really appreciate that. Well, I would like to take the opportunity to thank you everyone for your participation, especially my team for compiling the information and for the great presentation. The presentation slides for both days will be emailed in the next week or so. Any remaining questions in the chat feature, which we have not been answered, will be addressed in the FAQ. The following information and the material will be available for the reference on HCD DR Grant Management Resources page in the next coming weeks, maybe about 3 to 4 weeks. The presentation, the webinar recording, and the FAQs. With that said, we'll conclude this webinar. The next 2 slides will be showing a number of tools and resources that can be utilized by the subrecipients. Back to you, Sergio.
Thank you all. That concludes this meeting. And you guys have a great rest of your day.